This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that tolerated distortion for so long that it forgot how to correct it gently. And when it finally moved, it didn't adjust. It severed. What you're watching right now is not accountability arriving on time. It's legitimacy arriving late, very late. For years, something fundamental was allowed to operate in plain sight. Reshaping incentives, rewarding exaggeration, teaching everyone watching that the rules were flexible, until suddenly they weren't. No warning, no calibration, just force. That kind of correction doesn't restore trust. It shocks it. And the most dangerous part isn't what collapsed. It's what had to be ignored for collapse to become the only option left. If you think this is about punishment, you'll miss what comes next. Stay with me. Because to understand why this happened, you have to stop looking at who fell and start looking at what waited so long to act. What actually controls a system like this is not ideology. It's not loyalty. It's not even power. It's tolerance. Institutions don't fail when rules are broken. They fail when rule breaking becomes predictable. When exaggeration is priced in. When enforcement becomes optional, then negotiable, then ceremonial. Over time, that tolerance turns into a quiet operating system. Banks adjust. Insurers adjust. Regulators adjust. Everyone builds spreadsheets that assume distortion is normal as long as it's profitable and contained. That's the real shift. Not corruption as an exception, but distortion as a feature. And once that happens, accountability doesn't disappear. It accumulates silently in the background until one day the cost of continuing becomes higher than the cost of stopping. Not morally, systemically. At that point, the system doesn't correct. It panics. And panic doesn't look like reform. It looks like overcorrection. That's the frame you need. Because what happened next wasn't sudden at all. It only looked that way from the outside. For a long time, this didn't feel dangerous because nothing collapsed. Nothing stopped working. Nothing triggered alarms. Before, distortion was rare. It was noisy. It carried consequences. Now, distortion became quiet. Routine, professional. Numbers weren't falsified outright. They were stretched, framed, adjusted, depending on who was asking. One version for credibility, another for leverage, another for optics. And the system adapted to that. Lenders learned which numbers to ignore. Auditors learned which questions not to ask. Oversight learned to move slowly. That's how slow change becomes lethal. Not by shocking anyone, but by teaching everyone that this is just how things are done now. No single moment demanded intervention, so intervention never came. Until the past and the present could no longer be reconciled. Until the gap between reality and representation became too large to paper over. And when that happens, the system doesn't rewind. It snaps forward. That snap is where the danger lives. Because once normalization breaks, it breaks everywhere at once. Then came the moment the system could no longer pretend this was abstract. A ruling landed, not a fine, not a warning, not conditions, an order to dismantle completely. A business structure was declared so distorted, so internally unreliable, that it could not be corrected without endangering everyone around it. The language was clinical, almost cold. This wasn't about one false document. It was about patterns, years of numbers that changed depending on who was reading them, assets expanding and shrinking on command, reality treated as optional. And suddenly, the system did what it always does when credibility is at stake. It chose the most extreme remedy available, not because it wanted to, because it felt it had to. This is the moment people misunderstand. They see punishment, they see drama, they see history. What they don't see is panic. If you're trying to make sense of why this escalated so fast, don't look at the ruling. Look at how long it took to get there. Because when institutions wait too long, they don't respond proportionally. They respond decisively. And once that line is crossed, there is no partial rewind. There is only one direction left. What made this unavoidable wasn't arrogance. It was architecture. This is how the mechanism actually works. Modern corporate systems don't rely on truth. They rely on confidence bands, ranges, assumptions. As long as numbers stay within an acceptable spread, the machine keeps moving. But when the same entity presents radically different realities to different audiences, banks, insurers, tax authorities, the system can no longer triangulate what's real. Risk models break. Trust collapses. At that point, the damage isn't isolated. It's transferred. Lenders absorb uncertainty. Markets absorb volatility. Regulators absorb blame. And the benefits? They were already extracted. Cheap credit, brand amplification, leverage without transparency. That's the imbalance. Upside is privatized early. Downside is socialized late. So when the reckoning comes, it doesn't target the behavior. It targets the structure that allowed the behavior to persist. That's why reform isn't enough. Monitoring isn't enough. Penalties aren't enough. Because the system isn't trying to correct misconduct anymore. It's trying to remove a source of instability. That's a very different motive. And it explains why what happened next felt sudden, severe, and irreversible. Everything accelerated after that. No pose, no soft landings. Filings multiplied, deadlines tightened. Oversight turned urgent. What had once moved slowly now moved all at once. Assets were no longer symbols. They were liabilities. Operations weren't businesses anymore. They were risks waiting to spread. Every additional day of activity became a problem. Not politically, structurally, because once a system decides something is unsound, it stops asking why. It starts asking how fast. That's the escalation phase. Short sentences, hard edges, no room for interpretation. This is where people expect restraint, negotiation, compromise. But systems don't compromise when credibility is on the line. They compress time. They eliminate ambiguity. And the faster this moved, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't about correcting the past. It was about preventing contagion. Because instability doesn't stay contained. It leaks. It teaches others what they can get away with. And once that lesson spreads, enforcement becomes impossible. So the system chose speed over subtlety, force over finesse. And that choice has consequences. Because when power moves this fast, someone always absorbs the shock next. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because when systems overcorrect, they don't hit balance sheets first. They hit people. They hit workers whose paychecks depend on structures they didn't design. They hit communities built around names, properties, promises that suddenly mean nothing. They hit you not because you participated, but because you lived downstream of it. You were told stability meant success. That scale meant competence. That longevity meant legitimacy. So you planned around that assumption. Jobs, investments, expectations. And now, overnight, the story flips. Not because the rules changed, but because they were enforced all at once. This is what delayed accountability looks like in real life. Not clean, not fair, not targeted. It's blunt force. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The longer systems wait to act, the less precise they become when they finally do. If you've ever wondered why trust feels thinner lately, this is part of it. Institutions teaching the public that consequences arrive late and violently. If this feels unsettling, it should. Because this isn't isolated. And if you want to understand how far this spreads, you need to see what happens when this kind of shock leaves one system and enters another. Stay with me. This didn't stop at one jurisdiction. It couldn't. Because systems like this are networked. Capital crosses borders faster than law. Risk migrates before regulators even compare notes. When a structure is declared unsound in one place, others start asking quiet questions. Banks reassess exposure. Partners reprice relationships. Insurers tighten language. Everyone recalculates. Not out of principle. Out of self-protection. What looked like a local enforcement action becomes a signal event. A message transmitted without speeches or press conferences. This is what markets listen to, not rhetoric. Signals. And the signal here is destabilizing. It says longevity is no longer proof of safety. Brand is no longer insulation. And tolerance has limits, even if those limits are enforced late. That uncertainty doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward into contracts written years ago, into assumptions baked into models that were never stress tested for this. The danger isn't collapse, it's hesitation. Because when systems hesitate, investment slows, trust thins. Everyone waits for the next shoe, and no one knows where it drops. Now the system faces three paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration, rules enforced earlier, signals corrected before distortion hardens into structure. This is the least dramatic outcome and the rarest because it requires institutions to act before they're embarrassed into action. The second path is erosion, selective enforcement, memory fades. The lesson is absorbed, then slowly ignored. Distortion returns just smarter, more distributed, harder to isolate. The system survives, but trust thins year by year. Then there's rupture. That's when delayed accountability becomes the norm. When enforcement arrives only at the breaking point, when corrections come as shocks, not signals. Markets lurch. Politics radicalizes. Institutions lose the ability to persuade, they can only compel. We are closer to one of these paths than we like to admit. But which one we're on depends on what happens after the spectacle fades. Not the ruling, not the outrage. What gets normalized next? Because systems don't fail all at once. They fail by teaching everyone what to expect. And right now, expectation itself is unstable. This is the part that doesn't resolve because systems like this don't end with decisions. They end with precedents. What you just watched wasn't closure. It was a warning signal not about one entity, but about how long distortion can operate before correction becomes destructive. If you're looking for reassurance, you won't find it here. The danger isn't that enforcement happened, it's that it waited. And now the question isn't whether rules exist, it's whether they arrive early enough to matter. Because every delayed correction teaches the same lesson. Push until you can't. Extract while you can. Accountability comes later and hits everyone. If this pattern continues, legitimacy won't erode quietly. It will snap again somewhere else. So don't treat this as a one-off. Watch what gets tolerated next. Watch what's waved through because it's inconvenient to stop. If you want to understand where this is heading politically, economically, structurally, you can't afford to look away now. This story isn't over. It's just changed location. Follow it.